Hello, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to the second forum in LMU's Anti-Racism Project. My name is Bryant-Davis, and I'm the Chief Programming Officer for the Associated Students of Loyola Marymount University. This month's topic is healing and liberation and traumas tied to racism. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first guest. Since arriving at LMU in 2015, our 16th president, Timothy Law Schneider, has challenged the university to reimagine our global creative and interdisciplinary footprints. Please join me in welcoming President and Professor Timothy Law Schneider.
We need to unmute the president, please.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Can y'all hear me? Brian, thank you. I think this is the first time anybody has ever said we need to unmute the president. Usually it works the other way around. But Brian, thanks again. I also thank our Vice President for Intercultural Affairs, Jennifer Abe, and the planning team for organizing today's forum. I'm especially grateful to our keynote speaker, Dr. Tama Bryant-Davis, for gracing us with her insights and expertise. I thank the ASLMU and the GSLMU who will facilitate the discussion later in the program, and to all our students, faculty, and staff who have joined us for the first time or who are coming back to partake in this second important forum. Thank you and welcome. Allow me please to reaffirm these fora will always be safe and welcoming places for us to hold our conversations, hold each other accountable, do so with no shame, no embarrassment, learn from our mistakes. And we can do that, I think, through the help of one another and also by being honest with one another. And we're so good at that at LMU. So let's keep that tradition alive and healthy. And let us also be inspired by the words of Pope Francis, who just popped out another encyclical, and this one is called Fratelli Tutti. And the Pope told us, together we can seek the truth in dialogue, in relaxed conversation, or in passionate debate, but to do so calls for perseverance. It entails moments of silence and suffering, yet it can patiently embrace the broader experience of individuals and peoples. With today's conversation, we seek to embrace that broader experience with perseverance, or some like to say perseverance, as we engage our LMU community in an honest dialogue about the trauma and impacts of racism. I am humbled and I am thankful that I'm able to be part of this conversation with each of you. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, President Snyder, and welcome all. My name is Taina Rodriguez-Berardi. My pronouns are she, hers. And I'm a second-year graduate student in the Yoga Studies Master's Program, where my research is focused on the intersection of modern yoga studies and social justice. I'm also the Vice President of Graduate Students of LMU, known as GSLMU, and I'm pleased to be here, really co-hosting this virtual forum, because as both a student leader in the macrocosm and a global citizen on the macrocosm, microcosm as the student leader, I truly feel that these conversations help us cultivate a deeper connection and understanding within our community. And understanding that in order to heal and liberate ourselves from systems of oppression, we need to address the traumas of racism head on. This is the theme of tonight's dialogue, and with that, I would love to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Tama Bryant-Davis. Dr. Bryant-Davis is a licensed psychologist, ordained minister, and sacred artist who has worked nationally and globally to provide relief and empowerment to marginalized persons. Dr. Bryant-Davis received her doctorate from Duke University in clinical psychology with a focus on the cultural context of trauma recovery, as well as the intersection of gender and racial identity. She completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical Center's Victims of Violence program and is a past American Psychological Association representative to the United Nations. She's a tenured professor of psychology at Pepperdine University, where she teaches on trauma in diverse populations and clinical skills. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tama Bryant-Davis to LMU and our virtual forum.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, and I'm so glad to be here. Honored to be with all of you and grateful for the presence of your president, vice presidents, planning committee, and all of those who have worked tirelessly, not only for this event, but for us to continue moving forward in the midst of 2020 with the multiple traumas of this season. As was shared, I'm Dr. Tama, and my parents, while both Black Americans, African Americans, wanted to give my brother and I African names with meaning. And so Tama means queen. It is from Ghana, from the Akan. And they had a feeling, being Black in America, there would be times in my life when I needed to be reminded of who I am, so that even when people hate or fear, they are forced to call me queen, and that's a good thing. And my middle name is Simone, after the incredible artist Nina Simone, and I am fully aware of the healing power of the arts, personally and politically. And I am the daughter of two ministers, and so recognizing part of our healing is our spiritual wellness, and integrating that as we think about health and healing holistically. So I am reminded in the movement, the civil rights movement, of my four parents singing, "I ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up to freedom land." And so what we are reminded of in this season is the need for a radical hope, that while we see the political landscape, while we see the erasure and silencing, while we see Black death and terror and torture, while we see mass incarceration, we acknowledge all of that. And so to show up in the midst of all of that and believe that healing is possible and necessary, that liberation is possible and necessary, that we desire to not only survive, but to thrive, it requires a radical hope. And while we gather in this space with some who are overflowing with hope, I am clear that there are also people who have tuned in this evening who are exhausted. And we all have our seasons of just being, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so it is important that we come to a place where we can be honest with ourselves and with each other about the impact that these traumas have had on us physically, emotionally, spiritually, as we desire to be well. My pronouns are she, her, and as we are 2 days out of Indigenous Peoples Day, it's important to recognize we are having this conversation on the land of the Tongva people, and so we want to acknowledge and to honor them. I will share my screen so we can get started. As I'm going through, you can put your questions in the chat, and I will reserve about 15 or 20 minutes at the end, probably 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. All right. Healing and liberation, addressing the trauma of racism. And of course now, even though we tested it, now it doesn't want to move. But guess what? Being a Black woman in America, I am not deterred. We'll just do it again. We'll just come out and do it again. Maybe I'll try it with that one. No, that's not the one I want. All right, we'll do it with the PDF. I don't mind. Healing and liberation, addressing the trauma of racism. So we want to be mindful of the power of the word, the spoken word, and the written word. Lucille Clifton, an incredible African-American poet, wrote these words: "Come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Come and celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed." So it is important that we recognize the pervasiveness, the persistence of racism, and the mythology of white superiority or white supremacy, that we are bombarded with these messages even prenatally when we look at the disproportionate death of Black babies and Black mothers, even in childbirth. We recognize that very early we are bombarded with racism in our school curriculums, in our notions of safety, in housing, in education, in mass incarceration. And so even when we show up in our university, in our campus settings, we are met with racism in the syllabus, in the reading list, in who is present and who is absent, in the representation among faculty and administrators, and in terms of student body. And so in the midst of all of that, those who are gathered here today, I celebrate you, I honor you, that as you have been affected and impacted by the realities of racism, that we are still here with another opportunity to create the beloved community. And there's a Mexican proverb which reads, "They tried to bury us, they didn't know we were seeds." And really, the intention of racism is to bury, to dehumanize, to silence, to shame, to disenfranchise, to disempower. Racism is more than someone not liking you. It is systemic, it is structural, and we see that even with the resistance to us acknowledging that it is systemic and that it is structural, that it is really a Jedi mind trick to say that those who name racism are being racist. And so we come on today to shatter silence, to shatter shame, and to tell the truth without fear, to speak it boldly, knowing that we cannot heal a wound that we refuse to name. We cannot heal a wound that we will not acknowledge. And so we acknowledge it on today and recognize that the intention of it systematically is to keep power the way it is. And so those who say they are apolitical are actually saying they support the status quo. If I do not voice an opinion about what is, while people are being marginalized and oppressed, it means I support the continuation of what currently is. And so Judith Herman, a wonderful psychiatrist who wrote the book Trauma and Recovery, a key book in trauma psychology, she says it is easy to side with perpetrators. All they require is your silence. It is easy to side with offenders. All they require is your silence. It is much more difficult to be an ally. It is much more difficult to join in the movement, in the resistance, because it requires sacrifice and discomfort so that we can actually shift the environment around us and within us. So we want to move beyond awareness to actual engagement. Sometimes we believe we're doing something by simply admitting that racism exists. And while acknowledging that racism exists is a necessary step, if I stop at the point of awareness, then I have done very little. And so what we are calling for today, as we address the wounds of racism and fight for liberation, is actually an anti-racist stance, an anti-oppression stance, where I not only acknowledge it, but I have a vantage point, an attitude, and engagement, which is to dismantle it. And so we are moving beyond awareness to engagement. And then we are operating from a place of cultural humility. Cultural humility is very important in mindfulness, which comes from Buddhism at its roots, at its core. They talk about having beginner's mind, which is really about humility. And in Christianity, the teaching is, in order to enter the kingdom of God, you must come with the humility of a child. And so for us to really enter into this space, we have to be teachable. And one of the challenging things about racism is often we are told not to talk about it, and to, while we're not talking about it, to assume an arrogance, which would be that I already know what that is, I already know about it, which makes it very difficult for us to learn, for us to grow, for us to heal. And so I appreciate those who have entered into this space with an openness, with a curiosity, with a willingness to be changed, to be transformed. And I also, as you ask your questions, am open to learning, to growing, to being transformed. When we come in with that attitude, then it is limitless what we can achieve. And so we want to first move from denial to awareness, from awareness to engagement, and an engagement not with arrogance or defensiveness, but an engagement with humility. And so then welcome into this space where we can learn and grow and heal together. And so we have to really work on eradicating racism and pushing back against the denial and the minimization of racial trauma. Audre Lorde wrote, "This woman is Black, so her blood is shed in silence." So we think about the ways in which many people are unaware of the impact of racism. And a part of it is, if I am in denial, I don't have to do anything about it, right? If I just say that this is in these people's minds, right? As we're looking at the anti-Asian rhetoric, particularly this year, but that has been ongoing, when we look at the racist response to immigrants, depending on which country they come from, when we look at anti-Black racism, then we would recognize that there has to be an impact to these violations, but often culturally, and for some people religiously, we are taught to mask. And so people show up in your Zoom classroom looking fine. From the Harlem Renaissance, the poem comes, "We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our teeth and shades our eyes." And so many of your students, your colleagues, even administrators were raised to mask. So in our community, it is that you have to always be ready, always prepared, always show strength, never let people see you weak, never let people see you hurting, never let people see you in tears. And when we think about intersectionality, our multiple identities, for some people, there is also a layer of their religious teaching that requires what some have called toxic positivity, where there is no room for us to be able to talk about our sadness, our despair, our depression, our anger, because you have to always be grateful and positive and upbeat and optimistic. And we know that the reality of religious and spiritual teaching is that there has to be space for the fullness of our humanity. If there is no space for my blood, then in fact, that's dehumanization, that I have to pretend to always be fine. And so for us to be aware, even as we show up in these boxes, that there are stories that have not been told. And so historically, trauma was often looked at as, from psychologists, as an experience of war veterans. And then that understanding got expanded to recognize it's not just people on battlefields who experience trauma, but in homes and in schools, in backyards, in playgrounds. People are experiencing trauma in their bedrooms, they're experiencing trauma. And so the category was broadened. And more recently, there has been really an advocacy for recognizing societal trauma, which is oppression. racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, able-bodyism, that oppression can be traumatizing, and yet there has been a resistance from some within trauma psychology of recognizing the impact of oppression. And so then you would ask yourself, why is it a person would be willing to recognize the trauma against one person, but not a trauma against a whole group of people for hundreds of years, right? What would be the resistance to acknowledging that? And so we recognize what has been called intergenerational trauma or historical trauma, and some people have called it ancestral wounds. So it is the impact, the legacy of what has been passed down in terms of how your foreparents were treated, but then we also have the contemporary reality of continued racism. So some people will say, you know, slavery was a long time ago. Why are you all still upset about that? So one, we want to recognize that slavery was longer than the paragraph that's usually written in a public school or private school history book, but we are talking about hundreds of years of violation. The 1600s, the 1700s, going all the way to the mid-1800s before we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. And then even after the Emancipation Proclamation, the right to vote did not come until the mid-1960s, 100 years later, yes? So it has been less than 100 years, since Black people even had voting rights. And we also recognize the impact on our Latino brothers and sisters, our Asian brothers and sisters, American Indians, the intergenerational impact of violation and dehumanization, and the contemporary reality, because racism continues to today. So I want you to take a nice deep breath, because often we don't have these conversations, and when people, and in particular it's me that's talking, when a Black person speaks passionately about racism, some people get nervous. So even though we're on Zoom, some people get anxious. So I invite you to take breath and recognize what it means for people to have had to cover up their pain with smiles, right? What it has meant to try to cover up pain with excellence, because many were socialized and raised to believe you have to always be twice as good, you have to always be ready, you have to always be prepared, and that even that pressure has an impact. So not only do we have the realities and the impact of being a primary target of racism, but we also have the impact of vicarious traumatization. What it has meant this summer and for the years before that to see Black death on cell phones and social media, what it means to log into Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and see faces like you murdered by those who are supposed to supposedly protect the community, and then there is no consequence for Black death. So then we understand that to be state-sanctioned violence. What it means to see face after face, person after person, to see Black death, to see hashtags, and no justice. So there is an impact on that, even if you did not know them personally. So we really have to take sacred pause to understand the ways in which we are affected by racism, and to recognize that it's not just a matter of opinion. Because some people will say, well, I just disagree with you. So I'm not talking opinion, right? We're talking about the facts of racism existing even when we do studies with applications, job applications. The application is the same, but you change the name to a Black sounding name, and the person is less likely to get the job. That if someone is applying for a home loan, the application exactly the same, but you change the race, less likely to get the loan. More recently this year, they came out with a study that found if people come to do an appraisal of your home, if you have objects up that identify you as a Black person, the home gets appraised for less than if you remove those objects. And so we're talking about facts, right? When we talk about racism, we are talking about facts. So the wounds of racial trauma show up in multiple ways. For some of us, there is depression. And as I named, it can be exhausting to see these experiences happening time and time again. And while some people show up with a traditional depression, some people have what's called irritable depression or high functioning depression. So those are your colleagues who are still teaching their classes, but very much depressed. Those are your students who are still sitting there in Zoom, but are depressed. Not only do we have depression, but many people are anxious, worried, fearful. And yes, some people are angry. And when we talk about healthy response, if something is outrageous and I find it outrageous, that would be a healthy response, right? So it just becomes what I do with my anger, not the fact that I am angry, because anger comes from having a goal and the goal being disrupted. So if my goal is justice, if my goal is equity, if my goal is liberty, and that gets thwarted, then I am going to have a feeling about that, right? Some people have post-trauma symptoms, so that can be intrusive thoughts, you know, that you don't even want to think about it, but you are forced to think about it. Some people will say, well, why don't you all just stop talking about it? Well, if it would stop happening, we would have less to talk about, right? So these intrusive thoughts, or some people, there is avoidance of people, places, or things that remind you of the trauma. And that can be some of the distancing that we see, some of the distrust that we see, that those things don't come out of nowhere, you know? So for example, even in the medical field, we are aware of doctors having bias, even in my field, mental health professionals having bias, which is a softer word for racism, a particular type of bias. And so, you know, I just give you by way of example, my father is in his 70s, and he was very alarmed when I shared with him on my license that I had checked the box for me to be an organ donor. And he was very anxious because from his lived experience, he said, do you understand if you are on the borderline and there is a white person that needs your organ, do you understand the decisions that will be made about your organs, about your life, right? So this is not just someone with a thought disorder. This is not someone who is just suspicious out of the blue. It is what he has lived and experienced as a 77-year-old man in these United States, yes? So some people are dealing with suicidal thoughts and hopelessness and helplessness. Some cope with substance dependence, fatigue, disconnect. Some of us who are listening deal with somatic complaints. A somatic complaint is a physical symptom that doesn't have a medical explanation. It is an expression of our distress. And so some have headaches and nausea and body ache. Relevant to school, some of your students have difficulty concentrating, remembering, and focusing, and some of our colleagues as well, difficulty concentrating, remembering, and focusing. Blocks to our access of resources. Physically, more likely to die, to have injury, infection, even as we look at the disparities in COVID-19. And then there's also the spiritual impact, that for some people there can be a loss of faith, or feeling like God must be mad at us, or a sense of there must not be a God because how could this be fair or just? And then you have the other end of the spectrum, people who hold even more tightly to their faith. Because some people will say, that is the only thing that is helping me to get through this. That is the only thing that is helping this to make sense or to be my source of hope. But there is an impact. So in African psychology, we recognize the importance of honoring spirit. And many times in Western psychology, we have stopped the conversation on cognitions and affect, thoughts and feelings. But for us to be holistic, for us, it means we have to also recognize the spiritual impact and the spiritual resources of our healing and our coping. And so we turn our attention to the importance of liberation. And in particular, liberation psychology means that we operate from a stance of being anti-oppression. It means that I operate from a place of holistic wellness, mind, body, spirit, relational, financial, political, educational. I look at the impact of systems on people, and I look for our strengths. That when we name racism, it is not the desire for people to look with pity, right? It is not the desire for people to look at, these poor people we feel so sorry for, but to recognize the strength, the resilience, the possibility, the purpose, and the barriers so that we can work collectively to dismantle those barriers. And so liberation psychology originates from Latin America, and it is grounded in this commitment to being anti-oppression. And not surprisingly, it emerges out of the realities of oppression. So often Western psychology focuses on coping, and the end of healing is coping and meaning making. And that is really a Western approach, a colonial approach that puts the responsibility solely on the mind of the individual. So many psychology journals will talk about perceived racism as if it's just in your mind, and that if you shifted your mind, then everything would be better. But we recognize from a liberation standpoint, from the standpoint of Black psychology, social justice-oriented psychology, that we have to pay attention to context, and we have to address context. So oppression affects us mentally and emotionally and spiritually, but the solution is not just in the individual, it is in the collective. So, if I experience sexual assault, there's one thing to say, teach me how to cope with having been assaulted. It's another thing if I start to look at sexism and the media and the ways in which there are power differentials. And when I start to look at rape culture, then I will start really shifting some larger things instead of saying it's just for individuals to cope, right? So when we talk about healing and liberation around racism, it's not just, I need students to be stronger, right? It's not just that, our colleagues of color need to learn how to be more resilient. It is that we are intentional about examining the systems that are at play and the changes that we need to make systematically, the changes we need to make in our policies, the changes that need to be made in how we approach rank, tenure, and promotion, the changes that need to be made in terms of our curriculum development, our strategic planning, and so that we can really be committed to creating an environment and a community that is promoting liberation, right? That is promoting equity and inclusion, and to do that means more than tokenism. It's about also representation. So tokenism is when we are glad to have diverse faces because we want to put them on the brochure, or we want to feature them in the newspaper, or we want to put them on our website, but we don't really want to be transformed by their presence, right? We don't want to be open to their ideas. We want them to merge with our process and just be a different face. But when we talk about representation, it means we are willing to be transformed by the changing of who is seated at the table, right? That I don't just want you to come in to LMU and go along with what we have been doing if a part of what we are doing is problematic. So we want to be careful not to pathologize or demonize students, faculty, or administrators who start to name the problems and the issues. That they care enough about the community and the campus to want to make it better. As James Baldwin says, it is because of my love of this country that I have to critique this country. And so when people are observing that there are issues that need to be addressed, that there's change that is needed, for us not to get resistant or angry or to label them, but to welcome not only the critique, but then what are the solutions? What are the ways that we can work together for liberation in our environment? And we want to be aware of intersectionality that is belonging to multiple oppressed groups at the same time. And so what is the experience of gendered racism? What is the experience of women of color on the campus versus men of color on the campus? What is the experience of LGBTQ people of color on the campus? What is the experience of those who are differently able and racially and ethnically marginalized, right? And so all of those pieces come together and affect the ways in which we are treated and identified. And so a part of our healing is acknowledging that. It is learning how to define ourselves, to not be defined by oppression or by racism. It is building community support. And a part of that community support will be with people who are from the same heritage. And then there's also the need for community support with people who are from diverse backgrounds, who are willing to stand in the gap, who are willing to speak up. It is liberating to discover that if I'm the only Black person in the room, that even if I don't say something, someone else will. It is labor, perpetual emotional labor, to know that if I don't speak up, no one will. And so we do not have to be a part of a group to speak up when a group is being treated unfairly. So community support is important. Spirituality can be an important part of our healing. Use of the expressive arts, which some people have called artivism. And so let the spoken word artists share, and the dancers share, and the visual artists share, and let us express that in our campus community as a way of shifting the atmosphere. And so we are aiming not just for healing from racism, but we are looking for wellness. We are looking for growth beyond the end of my distress, because we know that sometimes people are no longer depressed or having a panic attack, but they still don't feel well in terms of their place in the campus, their place in the community, their place in the country, and the aim is wellness. So Dr. Maya Angelou said, surviving is necessary, but thriving is elegant. Surviving is necessary, but thriving is elegant. And so we want to help people to not only stop bleeding, but then to get back in touch with purpose and possibility and strength and actualization. And so we apply that. In society, when people see you struggling, they often say, what's wrong with you? But a trauma-informed person will say, what happened to you? And a culturally aware trauma-informed person says, what happened to you and to your people, you and your community, and what continues to happen? So I want to truly understand the problem. You know, what is going on with this student who is not showing up or who is showing up in distress? That this is not just a problem student, but this is a student who is facing problems. And one of those problems that they may be facing is racism, right? Not only out there, but in here. And I will say, working at multiple universities and campuses, that often we are prepared and equipped to help students to heal or cope with racism that's happening in the media or in some faraway place, but we become a little more uncomfortable with addressing the racism that is happening in here. But that is where we really need to begin. And so the reality is that many of us are carrying invisible wounds while we are highly visible. When you are one of a few on campus, many people are watching you. Many people see you when you are one of a few, but even while you are visible, large parts of your life are often invisible. From some people not taking an interest, and sometimes not feeling safe to share. So we want to be tuned into that reality. So as we are healing from racial trauma, we deal with the importance of acknowledging that it does exist, creating safe spaces where people can share of what happens when we share in classrooms. And our people, our professors, equipped to respond with support instead of, are you sure, or discrediting or minimizing. We want to be mindful of our counseling services and counseling center being trained and equipped to deal with racial trauma. We want to work on building trust even for people to build trust within themselves, because racism can dismantle and disrupt your confidence, even in yourself. So trust in self and then trust in each other. And that has to be earned, right? How do I say to a community, open up to me, I want to be here for you, but when they are observing me, they don't see that consistency. They don't hear that advocacy, right? And so we earn the trust, and then we have to deal with internalized racism, the realities of shame and imposter syndrome, right? So this idea where often people are told they don't really belong here, that they're not worthy of their place here, or they're only here to fill a number. But for us to really take seriously honoring that for our faculty of color and our students of color, they are not doing, we're not doing them a favor by having them on our campus, but they are doing us a favor of enriching the place with the realities of their wisdom, their knowledge, their experience. And so we recognize the need for healing, internalized racism, imposter syndrome, and shame, mourning the losses of racism, creating space for people to be able to speak and share their outrage, their anger, their frustration, teaching coping skills, but also teaching resistance strategies. And so we resist by fighting actively against racism. We can resist through protest marches and boycotts, but we also recognize for people of color in America, rest is resistance. That we are in a society where we're taught we have to constantly do and constantly prove that we are not lazy, constantly prove that we are enough. And so to be still is a radical act. For us to name that being marginalized and holding on to your joy is a radical act, which is why in the middle of protests, we can see people breaking out in the electric slide, singing and dancing. And we also know that resistance is an intergenerational, interfaith, multicultural movement. And so there is a reason why we can have radical hope, as we saw for the first time in this country's history. In all 50 states, there were people marching for racial justice, and even internationally, that there were people marching in solidarity. And so this resistance requires all of our different disciplines, from policy to education, from parenting to artistry and creativity, from administrators, even to those who are doing our technology services, to be mindful of each of these acts as an act that can be a part of the resistance. And so we learn how to take breath and take sacred pause, to recognize even in this moment, when you think about racism, the impact that it has had on you and your community, that we want to take breath and shift our narrative to tell ourselves a new story, that in fact we are not powerless, but that we are powerful, to know that we are not helpless, but that we have agency, to know that we have voice, and to know that in fact we are many, that there are many who are committed to this work, even those who are new to this work. So for some, this summer was an awakening. And while some people are suspicious about why did it take you this long, I say welcome. Even for late arrivals, I say welcome. If something about this summer sparked for you a commitment, a decision to work against racism, then I say welcome. And so for us to continue coping and healing and working toward our liberation, I invite you to think about writing and journaling, expressing yourself through the arts, engaging in spirituality, looking for social support, community that gets it, because it's exhausting to have to explain yourself. So I hope that you have those in this community that you can talk to, that you can be with, that understand and appreciate your journey. We recognize the gifts of bibliotherapy, books on addressing racism, and the need for self-calming as well, music, aromatherapy, walking, drinking water, setting boundaries, saying no. You don't have to do everything for everybody. There are mindfulness meditation apps, like Liberate is one, particularly for people of color. Shine also was created by a Black woman. And then there are those that are general, calm, stop, breathe, and think. Abide is a Christian mindfulness app. Liberate, many of those meditations are Buddhist. And so there are many practices, but from whatever cultural tradition you come from, there are ways that people heal. So I invite you to begin researching and asking your family about ways in which people handled their pain and their distress. Because while therapy is something I definitely recommend, and of course it's something that I do, I also know there are multiple pathways of healing and restoration, and we want to honor those and utilize those. So I want to say on today, even your presence is an act of resistance. You could have chosen to do a lot of things besides focusing on the trauma of racism. And I'm grateful that you were willing to show up for us to care for these wounds together, but also for us to make a commitment or to recommit to combating oppression, racism, in all of its forms. Thank you so much. I'll take your questions, and if we don't have questions, I have a few more slides I could cover.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryant-Davis. As she said, we will move forward with the Q&A portion of the forum. You can either raise your hand or you can put your question in chat.
As you're brainstorming, I can share a little more. Is that okay? Is that all right? Okay, and just stop me if a question comes in. So one of the slides I didn't get to was about the experience of white people during this time. And so, you know, what some have shared is a fear or a sense of like walking on eggshells, being afraid of getting it wrong. And I want to say, in working for racial justice, you will get it wrong, right? It's like, you know, I'm a straight person. And if I do a presentation or participate in a dialogue about LGBTQ issues, I come in with humility and a readiness to receive correction, right? Because if someone corrects me and my response to that is to like shut down and say, oh, they didn't appreciate me, right? Like I came to their event and they didn't appreciate me, so I'm never coming back. Like that, it's problematic, and it makes me the center, right? It calls for you to take care of me, right? So if I am a white person engaging in the work of anti-racism, to just know a part of that process and journey is correction, right? Is learning, and to not become shut down by that. So one of the terms people have talked about is fragility, right? If I am so fragile that people can't give me feedback, then we won't grow, right? So to be able to take in the feedback, to reflect on it, to integrate it, and to continue to show up is really important. And, you know, another one that comes up is just a lack of awareness of some people saying like, I didn't know, right? And that was a part of some people's awakening is now with the social media and the phones is, you know, people like, I didn't realize it was this bad or that this was happening. You know, well, you know, it is, right? This is what is happening. And then the last one I'll mention is when people get stuck in guilt, right? That some people will say, I just feel so terrible, I feel so bad. But the key is not to become immobilized by that, right? That if I find out about an injustice against another group of people, it's one thing for me to stay stuck in like, oh, this is so terrible and I feel bad, I'm benefiting and they're not, or at their expense. But it is another thing to say, okay, like this is terrible, and what can I do? I need to get to work, educating myself, becoming engaged, participating. So I will stop there and see if there were questions that came up during that.
We do have a couple questions.
Great.
The first question in chat is, for those that are multiracial, white and POC, how does one simultaneously heal from racism while also using privilege to participate in anti-racist work?
Yes, great question. Thank you so much. And so it is holding both realities, right? The ways in which you are targeted and marginalized, and also the privilege that some people will refer to as white adjacent, right? And so one of the challenges is that internal awareness, because you are having an experience that neither of your parents had, right? That sometimes if you're raised by family that is of your same race, then in some ways that racial socialization process is they can tell you like, this is likely to happen and these are things that you can do when we're dealing with multiracial or biracial children that neither of the parents have had, unless they're biracial, multiracial as well, have had that experience. So try to take like the wisdom from one and the wisdom from the other, and then you're living in a whole different time. And so having to carve that out and create it. And, you know, there are people who are doing the work in that area, but that perpetual mindfulness, and I would say it also starting within the family, right? Starting to notice, you know, what did you see growing up? Not just out there, right? But in here, right? What were the messages that you were told? I had a woman who recently interviewed me for her podcast, and she's Native American and Black, and was sharing how she just started identifying with the Black aspect of her heritage. And, you know, for the longest, she didn't, you know, want to be, right? And so looking, and everyone's story is different. For some, it could be, you know, the other way around, but looking at what were those messages, overt and covert, that affected me, and how do I hold the layers, right? I'll say the beautiful layers, but the complicated layers of my identity. So thank you for that.
Our second question is from Jen. She says, first off, thank you. Secondly, my question might be more of a sharing experience or in asking how to best support my students, Black, Indigenous, person of color, and white alike. I teach fiction writing courses, and so many of my students are writing about their horrors. For example, the current Armenian genocide. We seem to be facing so much in the world, and then we are facing it in our fictions. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Was that the end of it?
Yeah, any thoughts?
Okay, yes, thank you. So I love that class. That class sounds wonderful. Pinna Baker is a psychologist who has written a lot about writing for healing, and particularly writing about trauma. Can be very healing. And so I'm glad that you are giving them that opportunity, but a lot also can get stirred up. That the more you write and the more you think about it, some additional memories and emotions can come up that people have been suppressing or compartmentalizing. And so, you know, I would encourage thinking about not just writing about the events of what has happened to them or to their community, but to make sure to include feelings and thoughts before, during, and after, if it's ongoing, present day. And then we also, you know, can write about hopes for the future. If you were able to write the next chapter after this, right, what comes next? And so to start imagining what is possible, and also in the writing to make sure that they are able to center themselves in the narrative. There's an approach to therapy called narrative therapy. And sometimes in people's own life story, they have made themselves a marginal character. So it's like, this person did this to me, this person did this to me, and like I have no voice and I have no agency, even though it's my story. And so to tune into who's getting all the playtime in their writing, right? Where is their voice in that? Where are their feelings? What do they want? What do they need? How do they go after it, right? So yeah, I would say those, and then just some themes that come up related to healing trauma are mourning losses, having them write about the anger, having them write about trust, having them write about thriving, right, and growth. There's a lot of you are familiar with post-traumatic stress, but you may never have heard of post-traumatic growth. There can be growth in the aftermath as well.
I think we only have time for one or two more questions. Our next question is, Can you speak about the balance between free speech and creating a space for the opinion of others? What is your opinion on cancel culture?
Yes, great. And so we want to be mindful of, when we talk about everyone has a quote unquote right to their opinion. And there was, I wish I could credit them, but I think it was like an anonymous thing that was going around social media. If someone knows the credit, you can say it in the chat. But the statement was, we can have a respectful difference of opinion as long as your opinion does not question my right to exist. Right. So it's like, yeah, we could disagree about, what you like on your pizza, or we could disagree on like, what's the best major, political science or psychology, right? But if what your opinion is to dismantle me and my community, now that's not just an opinion, right? That there's going to be an impact to those words, and that there are powers and systems to support those words. I also just want to say around, because some people say, well, how do we have a quote unquote safe conversation around racism? And one, I say it's important to have a skilled facilitator, because I've been brought into places that tell me horror stories. If they brought people in and it was like bombs exploding, and then like the time ended and the person left and everything was like fallen apart. So the facilitation is very important. But then I will also say, what I tell my students is, I don't promise you you'll always be comfortable, right? Because learning about oppression, if you've been told the opposite, is going to be uncomfortable, right? Growth is, there's some pain in growing, right? So I think we have to be aware the conversation will not always be comfortable, but it is important for it to be paced and timed and protected in such a way that it is productive, even if what is being produced is a space for people to share. And the part about cancel culture, I would say I am, probably somewhere in the middle, in a sense of, I don't subscribe to, every time someone says like one thing wrong, like they are beyond redemption, right? But I do also not believe that, especially if people have power, if people are in powerful positions, that it can't just be, well, everyone makes mistakes and everyone is growing. Especially, we think about police officers, right? You can say like, oh, don't cancel them. It was one mistake. Well, that mistake cost someone their life, right? So I think that there do need to be consequences, and that can vary based on what people's position is. And I do believe that there can be growth and transformation when people are motivated to do so beyond just trying to get rid of their consequences.
All right, and thank you everyone for your questions. I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you for your answers, Dr. Bryant-Davis. We'll be moving now to our breakout rooms for small group discussions. And the planning committee has curated 2 questions for this discussion. What touched you the most as you listened to the speaker? And how does this apply to your experience and how we move forward to be anti-racist? We've left the definition of we open-ended. We can be the individual, the institution, or the country.
Thank you. And as you're going out to your group, I just have to say, I saw in the chat box, can the Black community stand in solidarity with the Latino community? And yes, that is definitely necessary, that when we are divided and divisive and just thinking we have to advocate for our own group, then it creates an atmosphere for oppression to continue. So there is a necessity for people to be in solidarity. So thank you for that. I tried to read very quickly through the comments.
And those 2 questions for your breakout room are in the chat.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm sure that Dr. Bryant-Davis' talk inspired everyone and provided a lot of fodder for your breakout sessions. I'd love to honor those conversations and open up the floor to see if anyone would like to share what came up in their group conversations in response to the question prompts, maybe 1 or 2 that would like to share with the larger group. And you can even type it in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself at this time. Somebody, Seal, could you put it to gallery view? Thank you. Does anybody want to share about what touched them the most as you listened to the speaker? And I know in our group we had various different answers. Or even how this applies to your experience as we move forward. And again, like Brian said, the we is up to interpretation from the individual all the way to the collective.
Okay, poor Taina here. This is like a faculty member's, worst nightmare. Being in Zoom, you're asking people to contribute something. Let's make sure everyone is able to unmute themselves. That's not a technical issue, but it doesn't have to be a profound observation. It's just like sharing, what did you get from this?
I'm right here with you, Abe. Hello, speaker. It's Lalo, everyone. I know, yeah, it is definitely my worst fear in my lectures, which actually always happens during the time in which we talk about anti-racism. But I really loved in my group, I had 2 students with me, which was fantastic. And we talked about what touched us about in terms of the speaker and what we listened to. And the main thing that I think that really resonated was the radical act of rest, and not needing to be that person who feels that obligation to have to speak so no one, because no one else will speak. But then also having that conversation with white folks and letting folks in the room who have more privileged identities than us, like being direct and saying, this is what I need from you. I need to trust that you're gonna speak up so that I can defer that from even my mind, right? Because even thinking about it or that moment of stress is still that emotional baggage that we carry around. And so that's a little bit of what we talked about and that radical act of rest, but trusting in each other, but needing to build that trust in community. And so I think that definitely stuck with me about the lecture, but also about what the students I was with were saying.
Thank you so much, Lalo, for sharing. The rest, the aspect of rest came up in our group as well, and just recognizing and honoring that holistic approach like you see in our university's mission. So I think all of us are aware of that, but hearing it again from an external speaker really brings it home. Does anybody else have any short thoughts or comments? Rabbi Zach has his hand up, so you can go ahead and unmute.
One thing that I was touched by that the speaker talked about, and others in my group mentioned as well, was this concept of toxic positivity. And it comes up in the Jewish community, I think, quite often. You know, we like to talk about social justice in a way that doesn't always hit, I think, or is reflective of the reality. I hear people talk, I was thinking about it in connection with the Black and the Jewish community. So people say to me often, you know, I thought the Black and the Jewish community were closer, or shouldn't they be more connected in this movement towards social justice? You know, didn't Rabbi Heschel march with Martin Luther King? You know, look at and I say, yes, that's part of the truth, but there is more. What is more true is that there wasn't always roses, and real life oftentimes get in the way, and certainly history does. So I thought about that, and then just in terms of how I bring this forward into living an anti-racist life, that's really hard. I find that we don't have enough practice. I know at 18 years old, I certainly didn't have virtually zero practice when it came to thinking about racism, or you know, we didn't talk about it in my home. I went to public school in Los Angeles, where everything was fairly white, I see in hindsight. So this is great. Like, the more that we can learn, read, practice, fail, is all good. I try to be nice and do nice things, which is not always easy. Ask my wife, but I think that's important. You know, I think the hardest part is thinking about resources and how I'm going to deal with that. You know, I have some resources that I can give or use that may be beneficial. And sometimes I don't always want to part with those resources, or don't know the best way to use them. And I think that's really important to think about and talk about, particularly in groups that have resources. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. I love what you said. Practice, read, learn, and fail. And I think that have that cycle on repeat is human, right? And I think we need to value that and appreciate it more. And you talked about resources. We will be putting some resources in the chat, and I know Rabbi Zach, if you want to share that with Dr. Abe and the rest of the group, we will be sending a email after this conclusion of this forum to anybody that RSVP'd with some resources found on the LMU Anti-Racism Project website, but also other links to LMU-based healing and mental health resources. So I want to thank you all for coming together and actively participating in this important dialogue. It's imperative that we as a university and community engage this process and reinforce our collective commitment to anti-racism at every level. We will be hosting another virtual forum on November 12th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. again via Zoom, and that one will be on the theme, or it is called Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. So again, we will be sending a recap email, and you can also find all of these these events on the Anti-Racism Project website from LMU. At this point, I'll pass the mic to President Snyder for closing remarks.
Thank you, Taina, for your patient leadership. You definitely evidence your yogic knowledge. I thank each of you for being with us today. I value your commitment to LMU, to our community, to one another. So let's keep this momentum going. I'm interested in learning about the heartland because I'm from there and find out what happens. I certainly have my own theories. So again, I thank you all. Just one reminder, this is the time to vote. Remember, in the same way that when we litter, it's only a tiny bit, but it means a lot when it all piles up, the same is true with voting. So we can kind of think of voting as our anti-littering habit, or something that contributes in a very positive way. Our votes do have meaning. And this is one way where we all can make changes. So especially students, get out there, make sure you do it. I don't want to have another one of these where I'll say, the youngsters didn't vote. Come on, get with it. Take care, everybody. And Jennifer Abe, thank you. And thanks to your team. And thanks to our students and leaders. Take care. Stay safe.